Well, I've got to be honest with you and say the clown show that is politics right now and the ANC in South Africa is just, well, at all-time heights. There's clownish and there's whatever the hell this is. This is just retarded. In any case, for those of you who don't know, apparently South Africa went into some refugee center and raided it. Now, I did do a video on this a couple of days ago, and I had a few people talk complete garbage about, oh, it wasn't this, it wasn't that. I said very clearly in that video, well, this is what the Americans say happened. This is what South Africa says that happened. And just for a little bit of a summary for you, well, what happened is that the Americans said that South African individuals went into this refugee processing center and it was a shit show. South Africa says that they went into there because there were 7 Kenyans who were working there illegally when they had no visa to work here and that they wanted to deport them effectively. Now, what we can take from all this is that the relationships between South Africa and the US is now at the lowest point it's ever been since the end of apartheid. We've seen this occur from numerous fronts. We've seen this since Trump's return to power. The Afrikaner refugee program has been a bone of contention for the ANC. Now, this raid to this US-linked refugee processing center has just been the straw that's broken the camel's back. Now, the allegations are that apparently when the South Africans went into there, these South African officials, there were allegations of intimidation, doxing, and diplomatic misconduct. Now, what began as supposedly bureaucratic immigration enforcement, remember that there were 7 Kenyans in there that they wanted to remove, well, this is now escalating into a full-blown diplomatic confrontation. And I did say that if it turned out to be true, and I did use the word if, I know there's a lot of people that can't listen for meaning, but I did temper all of the news that I gave because I don't really know, neither do you. So let's actually look at what's really gone on and why this is all kind of escalating. Let's also start this off by saying that the US Senate has now confirmed over 100 nominees which Trump has put forward in a single vote, and amongst them was Leo Brent Basil III. Now, he's going to be the US ambassador to South Africa. Now, Basil's appointment is actually controversial because it comes amidst all these worsening bilateral relationships between South Africa and the US. And Basil's son was actually involved in January 6th. Remember the supposed overthrow of the government that never really happened. In any case, he was later freed, the son that was, via the Trump pardons. Now, the Trump administration has signaled that they will have harder ideological driven foreign policy. And Basil's basically going to be the enforcer of it. Now, what we can look forward to with this appointment is an individual who basically doesn't have any patience for governments that he views or the Trump administration views as hostile or obstructive. And here we have South Africa, who is not in Trump's good books. Now, this all comes at a time with the Afrikaner refugee program, which I've made my views known on before, but let's actually just go through what's going on. Well, the refugee program, as you know, in South Africa is highly controversial because it's a pathway to Afrikaners and minorities. I should put that in. It also includes minorities, pathway to refugee status in America. Now, if you recall, the reason this program was put in place in the first place was because of what Trump claimed as white South Africans facing persecution, land seizures, and the genocide narrative. Now, as you know, the South African government has denied all those claims. Now, according to the latest news, the actual US refugee numbers intakes that they would take from South Africa was slashed. If you recall, the numbers were going to be just over 7,000. Now, Afrikaners have been given priority access, and this has been symbolic. It's been explosively symbolic, basically because of the race, land reform, colonial guilt narratives, and Western identity politics, with everybody saying that the only reason this program exists is because of racism and apartheid. Now, let's get on to what actually happened. So the US have had to set up these temporary refugee processing centers, and one was set up in Johannesburg, specifically in Sandton or Woodmead. Now, the applicants to the program were invited to the processing center via email invites. Now, when they went in there, their phones were confiscated and they were expected to remain on site all day in order for interviews to be conducted virtually, reportedly via these Kenyans. Now, the processing of these individuals involved NGOs linked to the US and Kenyan nationals who assisted with administration and logistics. Now, Home Affairs said that they conducted an immigration raid. 7 Kenyan nationals were found on tourist visas in violation of South Africa's immigration laws. Now, they were arrested because, according to Home Affairs, they were actually working there as employees, and so should have actually had work visas, not tourist visas. Now, Home Affairs issued deportation orders for these 7 Kenyans, and they were later self-deported. So actually, they weren't even deported by South Africa. They just jumped on planes and went. Now, they've been banned from re-entering South Africa for 5 years, typically the normal process when you're in violation of a tourist visa. Now, South Africa insisted that this was a routine immigration enforcement. They said that no refugees were actually harassed and no US officials were arrested. But this is where it starts getting tricky. Now, originally everybody said, well, maybe the US had kind of jumped the gun and this wasn't actually as bad as they said. It wasn't just a raid on a refugee processing center. Now, in retaliation, the State Department reacted, suggesting that US officials were actually detained and briefly held. Their passport details were publicly released. So that's a doxing kind of activity. And that the acts themselves amount to harassment and intimidation. Now, the US warned South Africa of severe consequences. The language used was unusually aggressive for a form of diplomatic exchange, which signals zero tolerance now from the Trump administration. They're just beyond the point of actually working with South Africa. Now, DIRCO rejected the claims outright. They said that South Africa is a sovereign nation, it has a rule of law that's non-negotiable, and our immigration laws apply to everybody. So they said that all they were doing is applying the immigration rules. Now, South Africa denies any doxing of US officials and any unlawful detention, and instead has suggested, this DIRCO suggesting this, that the reaction from the US was politically motivated, inflammatory, and disrespectful to South African institutions. Because when you can't fight the war on facts, you fight it on ad hominem arguments. Now, CNN reported that US personnel were briefly held and released, and that the refugee interviews were actually disrupted. CNN further said that Trump's genocide report lacks evidence. So they weren't just saying, well, this is what happened, but actually we agree with Trump. They don't agree with Trump, but they did release reports that this did occur, that US personnel were detained and that refugee interviews were disrupted. Now, South African officials countered this, saying that CNN exaggerated the events and that US staff were questioned but not detained. Now, the conflicting narratives do deepen mistrust between the two nations for obvious reasons. Now, information warfare now mirrors diplomatic warfare, so we don't know if this is information warfare just masking itself as forms of diplomatic warfare. We don't know. ANC figures, which included Fikile Mbalula, framed the whole dispute as the US bullying South Africa and neo-imperial pressure. I mean, it's always the same garbage with these morons. Mbalula warned that apparently Trump was attempting to isolate South Africa from Africa as a whole, and that South Africa must align more tightly with the continent, and that the continent must somehow back it up. Now, he pushed for African solidarity and resistance to Western pressure. And whilst his rhetoric may play well with ANC insiders, it is going to worsen relationships abroad. Now, not to be outdone by all this, AfriForum then waded into the whole discussion and said that they had done some investigations, and according to them, they can confirm that there had been harassment and intimidation at the US processing centers, despite them saying, well, they didn't do that. Now, according to Khalid Kriel, he said that according to his investigations, a number of individuals had passed derogatory comments on why South Africans going through the refugee process, and that all their personal details had been recorded with video footages of the actual individuals applying for refugee status having been taken. Now, in response to this, the ANC formally accused AfriForum of running a racist discrimination campaign aimed at undermining South Africa's democracy. Have you noticed that every comment the ANC so far said is like racism, colonialism, we're being bullied? Like there's no substance. It's all just crying foul with forms of victim claiming. Now, the ANC statement, also written by some guy nicknamed Stalin, I wish I was joking, says that AfriForum deliberately exaggerated claims of persecution and were internationalizing domestic issues, and that they were acting as a conduit for foreign political interests, particularly Trump's aligned networks. Now, the raid on the Afrikaner Refugee Center is being described by the ANC as lawful immigration enforcement and suggests that it has been cynically reframed by AfriForum into a false narrative of racial victimhood. This is rich coming from the ANC, as every single statement they've made is pretty much victimhood. Now, the ANC explicitly calls on the government to act firmly and decisively within the law against any group undermining constitutional institutions, spreading racial hatred, and colluding with external forces against South Africa. So undermining constitutional issues, I suppose that's like state capture, done by the ANC, spreading racial hatred, as done by the EFF and the ANC, and colluding with external forces against South Africa, like Iran or, I don't know, Cuba, like the ANC does. So apparently the government should act firmly and decisively within the law against groups. So when is the government acting against the ANC? In any case, AfriForum's CEO then claimed in retaliation that the raid amounted to harassment and intimidation. They confirmed that according to them, US officials were detained and that applicants were subjected to rights abuses. And Kali Creel says that the ANC's rhetoric places his own personal safety at risk, accusing the party of intimidation, undermining democratic principles, and using state power to silence dissent. And I must say, having read the statement myself from the ANC, that was actually my first point. I did think to myself, if an attack now occurs against Kali Creel, is the ANC going to hold itself accountable for inciting violence against a member of the state? Now, AfriForum has openly confirmed that they are in engagement with US officials, specifically to drum up opposition to ANC policies such as land reform, Bella, and the failure to condemn the Kill the Boer chants. Now, overall, the raid on the refugee center is going to be a form of diplomatic political fuse, which is going to be connected to an international explosion. For the ANC, AfriForum has become proof of foreign interference. Even though they're not, AfriForum has actually never made the claim, ever, of genocide in South Africa, ever. But they are constantly the scapegoat for the ANC, and all of the policy missteps the ANC have made, it's AfriForum's fault, apparently. Now, for the US, AfriForum's claims reinforce Trump's persecution narrative, and the ANC's rhetoric looks hostile to Western-aligned civil society, because it is. And whilst the ANC specifically go after AfriForum, it will give credence to everything that Trump has said. And whilst the ANC's response to everything that Trump is saying is, oh, screw these bullies, these colonizers, the what, let's go after Africa, it's going to show Trump that the ANC and South Africa is exactly who he says they are. Now, the results of this is that immigration enforcement has become political, because in typical fashion, the ANC politicizes everything. And diplomatic race politics have become forms of international leverage to be used by other states against South Africa because of the ANC's racial policies. This is no longer about visas or refugees. It's now about who controls South Africa's narrative abroad. Is it the ANC setting the narrative, or is it members of the state, private citizens of the state like AfriForum? And overall, we can see that all of this is going to lead with South Africa, you and me, being caught in the middle with real economic and diplomatic consequences looming. We are being brought into a fight between the ANC and its retarded policies by individuals who issue statements calling themselves Stalin. What are we, 5? But apparently, we are now going to feel the diplomatic results of a war between the ANC and Trump. The ANC will not win this. They are a small fry. They are going to be eaten by a shark. And the problem is, we are going to be caught in the middle. In any case, that's just my opinions. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.